This video is going to help you better understand the group presentation assignment. I'm going to cut over to a screencast now, and this will give you a better idea of exactly what I'm expecting and how to do well. Okay. Are working on the group proposition argument assignment. So you can read this yourself, but what I'd like to do now is go over and highlight some of the things that you're going to be using from your text and make sure that you understand really what I'm looking for. And again, this is going to be something that you will be creating as a presentation with your group. This will be delivered as an individual, and the goal here is to get you really familiar with creating policy cases. So arguments that are structured around a claim of policy. Eventually you're going to be writing a paper for yourself individually around a claim of policy, and you're also going to be delivering that particular content from that paper as an advocacy speech individually. So this is designed to help you get really familiar with how to do all of that. Okay, so when you're looking at step one, use the advocacy paper format. What we're talking about here is Appendix A. Okay, so we're looking at Appendix A. In your text, that's on page 277. Okay, so that's where it starts. They give you a little bit of an overview on that page. Down here, when you see policy, more stringent gun control policies must therefore be enacted. Again, anything that is advocating for change to the status quo, we can consider to be a claim of policy. So if you look on page 278, you see like a very broad kind of overview of 5 different sections that you might see in your, or that you will see in your policy case. Okay, so first thing is establish the problem. So severity. There we go. Okay, so very first thing that you're doing is you're saying that there is a problem. Okay, you do have an introduction before this. Let's just be clear of what to expect in the introduction. Somehow gain our attention first. Don't just start by saying, I'm going to talk to you about a policy case. You know, actually give us a little bit of background, something quick, something to get our attention. So then we're going to care right off the bat. After that, give us a preview of what you're going to do. So it could be something like, first, you could say something like, first we're going to talk about the problem that exists. After that, I'll show you a plan to fix that problem. I'll tell you some of the benefits. I'll show you some of the drawbacks and how those actually aren't that big of a problem. And last, I'll show you how you can get involved. Okay, something like that would be considered a preview. And notice what I did there, if you're looking on page 278, is I really did go through all of those 5 steps and just kind of said one sentence each. So then your audience is going to know where you're eventually going to go with each of these main sections. Okay, so after you've given us, you've gained our attention and given us a preview, you're establishing the problem. Now recognize that you're going to be establishing the problem separately from the plan itself to fix that problem. Okay, so don't try and blend the two. Don't talk about how you're fixing the problem yet. Okay, you might have kind of mentioned it maybe in maybe the topic, or also maybe a little bit like a very, very broad kind of idea of this in the introduction, but don't go into depth here. Try not to mention it. The idea is that you're trying to isolate the problem from the solution so you can create a tension and then a release of that tension. So you're trying to make us care that this is a problem, and then now that we're caring, oh, and here's how we fix it. So having those 2 separate areas is what's going to make it so your audience gets that sense of relief, and they're probably going to be buying into the solution even more if you talk about these things separately. Okay, so you're establishing the presence of a problem. So here, really, what's wrong? What's the problem that currently exists in the status quo? What's not as good as it possibly could be? What is wrong here? This is a section where you are probably bringing in research. This is, 99 times out of 100, you should have research here. Don't assume your audience knows anything. This is an opportunity to cite sources, to establish your credibility. Don't think that just because everybody's talked about something that you don't need to bring in research, and don't think that if you know a lot about something that you don't need to bring in research. The best scholars in any discipline are the ones who are still bringing in as much research as possible to support their argument for what it is that they're talking about. Okay, so tell us what's wrong. Here you can have statistics, you can have examples, again, what's wrong with the way that the world is. Okay, so you can just kind of talk about the problem, and then why should we care? This may or may not have research. A lot of times what you're doing here is you are telling your audience why that problem impacts them, or maybe even why this is something that they should specifically care about. If you tell me, let's say with our first topic here that college should be free, and you tell me that student loan debt, that there's $1 trillion worth of student loan debt or something like that, right? And then you cite a source for that, right? And you're telling us that that's part of the problem. Well, who cares? Right? Like, why is that bad? Yeah, it sort of sounds bad. $1 trillion sounds like a lot, but who cares? How does that affect people? How does that affect their lives? What does that actually do that creates suffering with the people that you are talking about? Okay, so you can tell me that 9 out of 10 people are hooked on drugs, but who cares? What's wrong with being hooked on drugs? What's the problem here? What does being hooked on drugs do to people's lives? I don't know, something like that, right? So just because you tell us that there are people that are impacted by something, and you tell us how many there are, you still need to sell it to us how this hurts them, how this changes their lives, how this hurts their lives. Okay, so this is where this is working off of values. So you're thinking, what would best resonate with your audience? How can they best relate to this problem? How can you make them care about this problem that exists? If you're thinking about this in terms of paragraphs and things like that, so this would probably be at least when I say paragraphs, I'm talking probably 5 to 7 full sentences, something like that. Okay, so now we've introduced the topic, we've established a problem that currently exists, you've convinced your audience that they should care, and now it's your job to provide a plan that's going to fix this problem. Okay, so here you're advancing a clear and workable plan. So these topics that I'm going to be throwing out here, don't think that usually creativity is not like the number one thing that we're looking for here. What we're looking for are programs and things that already exist, or programs and plans that are analogies or analogous to this that maybe you're working in other places. Okay, so let's say, for example, if, New Zealand has free college, something like that, and you can talk about how that works for them, and then we're going to adopt the New Zealand free college plan. I don't know if New Zealand has free college, but you get the idea, right? So you're advancing a plan. So don't think that you're coming up with this thing completely from scratch. Maybe you are, but probably not, because if you're using somebody else's example, if you're using something that already works, you have an opportunity to bring in research, and you have an opportunity to bring in sources, which will make it so the thing that you're talking about is more credible and more trustworthy. Okay, so here you are. That's good. Okay, if you're looking at this in our text, again, don't just go off of what I'm talking about here. There's more depth here. Look on page 282. They give you a quick example here with a 3-part plan that they're talking about. But really what you're trying to do is you've established this problem, then you're saying, how can we fix that problem? So what's a way that you can fix this problem? Okay, if you're looking for certain lengths and things like that, probably, we'll say, also at the top of page 280, when we're talking about solvency, this is a good point to be talking about this here as well. So we have to be able to show that this plan will actually solve that problem, and that this is something that's practical, right? Something that is reasonable, something that would actually be able to be done. It's able to overcome, like, you can't just say that we're going to have college be free and not talk about the financial consequences and not talk about any of the other potential issues. You have to talk about how this would be paid for, right? That's a reasonable standard, or else this is not a practical plan. Third point is the benefits. Okay, so you've talked about how, first of all, you gained our attention, you gave us an introduction, you established a problem, you told us how you're going to fix that problem, and now that you've told us how that plan works to fix it, now let's talk about all of the benefits. So this is sort of like two sides of the same coin, right? It's kind of like you're saying, these are the opposite of the problem, sort of. But there's definitely some differences. So here, what are all the potential benefits of your plan? Okay, so what are all the things that could potentially be positive? On page... Here we go. On page 284, your text talks about three different types of benefits: a probable benefit, a significant benefit, and a novel benefit. You might use these terms, you might not, but it's good to understand what they're talking about here. So I'm going to frame that in this way. So probable benefits, so these are the... Okay, so again, if you have research that you can support this, this is most likely where it's going to show up in terms of these benefits. A probable benefit is the benefit that's most likely to result by the particular plan that you're advocating for. So if you're making it so college is free by using the New Zealand plan, you can talk about how all the different things that happened with the New Zealand plan that were positive, right? So yeah, you might have overcome some of the debt, but you also were able to improve the economy, the debt for student loan debt. You were able to improve the economy, you were able to help people have better lives in whatever way, shape, or form. Okay, so here you're talking about the most likely positive things that are going to happen. Most likely you have research here that you are citing. Significant benefit. Your text says that this is a benefit that represents an important improvement in conditions for the individual or the society. So this is something that is kind of a big deal, right? So you're saying probable benefit, this is the thing that's most likely. Significant benefit here, you're also talking about this is the biggest deal possible. So let's say you're able to help people understand how education is a fundamental human right, and that maybe we're denying people that or something like that. So we are, in fact, treating people not as humans by forcing them to be enslaved by the system that we put in place. Or I don't know, you can get kind of dramatic with this if you want to, but you could say that the significant benefit, this is the thing that's the biggest deal. Sometimes you have plans where if you think about it, well, there's some extra things that might be happening that are possibly unexpected, unusual, unanticipated, but could possibly be happening. These are the novel benefits. So these are things that would be really good. They're not exactly directly related maybe to the problem that originally existed, but these are some additional benefits that you're going to get. Okay, so if you wanted to write about these, you could maybe do, at the minimum, if you decided to go through each one of these, at least one paragraph each. Kind of depends on the topic, depends on what research you have. I wouldn't try and do all three of these in a single paragraph. That's definitely, you need to extend it further than that. You might have three different significant benefits or, two different probable benefits. You might have 2 or 3 paragraphs each on those. It really depends on the literature that you have, so we'll say at least. It really depends on what's available to you, but really try and have research here. If you have analogies that you're using with your plan, so in other words, if that plan worked somewhere else, if somebody else did it, or it's a similar thing that worked in a different context, but you're trying to say that it would work in this context, then here's an opportunity to talk about all the good things that happened after they enacted that plan. So again, you might just be talking about the problem being fixed and what that looks like, but you might also be talking about some other things that are better now that the plan was enacted. The next section is answering counterarguments. Okay, so in this section, you have to ask the question, here's the question you have to ask. What are some reasonable arguments that people opposed to my argument might make? So again, with the topic that college should be free, what are some objections that people might have to this? Okay, well, one is probably it's too expensive. Okay, that's an argument that people might have. What's another one? People might say that if college is free, then people will lose their motivation because they haven't paid for it. People are less motivated for things that they haven't paid for. Okay, so those are reasonable arguments. What you don't want to do here is have ridiculous counter arguments that you are responding to, because that makes it seem like you are mischaracterizing your opposition and disrespecting your opposition. So for example, let's say that you had, again with the topic that college should be free. Let's say you said, well, if everybody had free college, then my opponents would say that everyone would then become a clown because they finally can. And now we'd have an entire city full of clowns. But this actually would not happen because, our majors actually do not have that many clowns. And even with the cheapest tuitions, the statistic significance of clown enrollment doesn't make a difference. Right? So that's a ridiculous argument. It doesn't help anything. What you're trying to do here is make your audience say to themselves, look, these people, they're thoughtful. You are a thoughtful person who has considered both sides, and you're making an objective assessment of the right thing to do here. Okay, so it's what are some reasonable arguments that people opposed to my argument might make, and then you still need to defeat these arguments. Okay, so let's say that somebody might say, okay, so the way you would phrase this is, now people opposed to college being free would say that this is too expensive. They would say that taxpayers shouldn't have to pay this because it's just too much money. But that's actually not true, because by having more people who are employed in society, we actually have people who are getting higher waged, higher skilled jobs, which brings more money eventually into the economy because they're the ones who are paying into it as well. And this thing actually does pay for it itself, especially since we're limiting this to community colleges where tuition is only about $150, $200 a class, depending on the school that you go to. That kind of money doesn't make that big of a difference in the grand scheme of things, and tax revenues would actually be offset by the overall productivity. We have an example that was brought to us by U.S. News and World Report that said blah, 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 blah. Okay, so then you try and give some sort of research that would defeat it. Again, with the motivation thing, same idea. Okay, so you're bringing this in a respectful fashion, but then you still have to defeat it. You can't lose to this argument that you bring up, because then it's like, why did you bring it up? And why are you arguing this if you don't believe it? So you have to still defeat the argument that you bring up, and ideally you're defeating it with research, with solid reasoning, and these counter arguments have to be things that if someone in your audience is listening to it, it might be something that they think of, right? It shouldn't be something random. It shouldn't be something that's kind of out there. The last point, and this is at least you probably want to have at least, probably two. If you just bring in one, unless it's the kind of issue where there's really just one big thing that you think your audience would think of, okay, fine, but usually you're going to have at least a couple. But remember, you're not going into detail too much about what the opposition would say, just enough where we kind of have thought about it, and then you're defeating that argument. The last point here is suggest some actions that members of the audience can take. So if people are listening to this and they believe you, what's the next step? If you're saying that college should be free, the people in a college classroom, if they're the ones that are in your audience, they can't make college free, right? They don't have the power to do so. Even if they agree with you, they can't do it right then. So what do, right? So the question is, how do you get your audience to, if they support this, to take some sort of action? Because these topics are action-oriented. If your audience agrees, then they should take some sort of action. Most likely what you're going to do with this topic would find out who your local representative is, who would be able to have some sort of influence in a topic like this. Again, this has to go through probably state legislature stuff, maybe federal, but most likely through the states. And you would need to figure out who the representative is that would be able to carry your voice in some sort of congressional or whatever it might be, bill or something like that. Or let's say that there's a petition that's available to be signed, and the more people that sign it, the more influence that has. That's another way to do this. But think about what can your audience do realistically that would be able to make this idea go forward and make it so it's got a better chance of being a reality. Now, for this particular topic that was the example here, this is something you can't do in class. Some topics you actually can do in class. Let's say that you were trying to argue for my audience should smile more. Okay, that's something that the action they can do, smile right now, plan maybe 10 times in the next day to smile. I don't know, something like that, right? But certain things you can do that are lighter and that are less government-oriented, but they're still considered claims of policy if you frame it right. Okay, so this would be ideally, you are being very realistic here with what your audience is capable of doing and what it is that would make a difference. Okay, so I hope this helps. What you're going to eventually be doing, though, for these in-class presentations is you need to have enough content available where any member of your group can take that content and present it as a speech to another group in class. Whether you're writing this whole thing out, whether you're creating like an outline that you would go from, but the expectation is that you're going through each of these different sections, that there is research that's being cited verbally during these presentations, and that anyone in your group can do it. Okay, so that's the expectation. I look forward to seeing all of these. You eventually will be doing 5, and all of you will get a chance definitely to present. Okay, so I hope this was helpful, and you can always email me any questions that you might have. Thanks.